Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. This is the first of our new series of weekly webinars. Very excited to say that we have a lot of people signed up for this one. We're expecting some interest in writing through a crisis, but not quite 200 and something people that signed up. Not all of whom have arrived yet, but it's lovely to have that much interest. So thanks, everybody. Just quickly, how this is going to work. On the next one. We've muted you as you arrive, so if you could please stay on mute, that would be very helpful. Obviously, with this many people on the call, which is lovely, it also means we can't really do kind of audience participation in the way we might otherwise. So I'm afraid we're just going to talk at you for about half an hour, but hopefully that will be instructive. And then if you do have questions, comments as we go along, if you could please type those into the chat box. And they should be sent to everybody, but if you could just make sure they're being sent to everybody. And then Orla from our team is going to be keeping a track of that chat, and she can feed the most frequent, the most interesting, most challenging questions to us at the end for a kind of Q&A. I can't let everyone speak because there's just too many of you, but we will try and make sure we get through as many questions as possible. So very quickly, not going to do a big spiel, but just in case you don't know that much about us, we are Read Words. We are a brand writing agency based normally in Soho in central London, obviously not right now. We basically sum our work and our mission up as the world's brightest words. That's what we aim to deliver. And by that we mean bright as in obviously creative and colourful and vibrant and interesting, but also bright as in clever. We see words as a strategic tool as much as a creative one. So that's our summing up line. Here's the team. So we're 10 people, based normally in central London, mostly writers, as you can tell, but we're unusual being a kind of proper full service agency with a client service team as well as the writing team. We do basically all kinds of brand language work you might imagine. The whole spectrum, really bucket it out into 4 key categories, which are about to pop up, I think. We go. So brand voice, verbal identity, tone of voice, that's what we want to call that is helping clients to find a voice that articulates and expresses their brand and authentic and differentiating, all those things. And that tends to mean, as you can imagine, building out guidelines. We do a lot of practical training, which we believe in very strongly, and all manner of very digital and remote work. I'm just going to stop. If we just make sure everyone's on, getting quite a noise coming through. I'm not sure where that's going from. Thank you. Yeah, a lot of digital and UX work, that's better, which is specific to digital products, websites, apps, etc. So not just the writing, but also helping build customer journeys, user journeys, and so forth. Copywriting is our big bracket for kind of everything you might imagine copywriters would do. So usually a specific practical project where we might be asked to write a film or a brochure or a poster campaign, what have you. So a very big bucket, that one. And then naming is the other specific thing we do, which so we've named and continue to name companies, products, new startups, rebranding companies, just about everything we've named, from the legendary toilet roll through to juice drinks and companies and even internal divisions. So naming everything. We do it for all sorts of people, from the very big to the very much smaller. As you can see, there's just a selection of people we're working for. To give you a sense of the scope, we did the Formula One tone of voice for their rebrand a couple of years ago. We also work for kind of 1 or 2 person startups who work across all sectors, as you can see, from the very corporate to the cultural sector and charities and so forth. And that variety is really important to us in terms of making our life interesting, but I think it's really valuable for our clients too. So that's enough spiel. On to today. So as I say, we're talking about writing through a crisis. A lot of people, as you can imagine, are asking us, how do I walk this tightrope of communicating what I need to communicate and what the business needs me to communicate, but in a way that's sensitive, that is not going to upset people, and is going to get the right things across. So how do you do that? It's really tricky. So hopefully we're going to be able to help you with that. And we've boiled it down into 3 key principles. Obviously, there's a lot we could say about this, but in half an hour, hopefully these 3 principles will really sum up the central things that we need to keep in mind when you are communicating in times like these. The first being clarity. Clarity is kind of always the most important thing of all, but I think it becomes especially urgent, if you like, in times like this. And Sam is going to run us through clarity.
Great, thank you, Mike. Hello, everyone. I'm Sam. I'm one of the writers at ReadWords. So yes, clarity is essential in any form of writing, pretty much any time, but particularly at this moment, and particularly at a moment when so many people have so many new questions they need answers for. So whether that's around the sort of language that coronavirus has thrown up, social distancing, how far is distancing, how far should I be away from people, does that include family, friends, all those sorts of questions. Furloughing, for example, as a word that I don't think many people were really aware of before this. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean for my job? How is it different from being laid off, for example? So now a lot of the job of answering these questions is obviously the job of government, and they should do that as clearly and usefully as possible. But at the same time, there are lots of questions being asked of brands as well. So questions like, how do I register for online shopping, for example? If you've been used to doing your weekly shop that involves driving to a supermarket or walking down the road, and suddenly you're asked to now register and do things in a very different way, well, how can a brand make that as easy as possible and mean that people are able to kind of carry on getting the things that they need as much as possible, through to really kind of simple everyday questions like, what are the opening hours for the post office? These are big changes that we're all having to adjust to, and these questions are being thrown up. So the job of brands and writers, I think, is to provide those answers as clearly as possible. I thought it would be useful if we took a look at a brand who's not doing such a great job with this. This is Halifax, a high street bank here in the UK. And this is how they're talking about a change to their opening hours. They don't have as many staff. They're obviously having to reduce the number of people that are coming to their physical location. So the opening hours need to change. And in this webpage, they've started off talking about how they're following the government advice and why it's going to help them provide essential services. But it isn't really until the end of the webpage that you actually come to the key piece of information, that the one thing that a visitor really is looking for from this webpage. And that's exactly what are the new opening hours. If I'm used to being able to turn up at my bank from 9 till 6, how has that changed? But it's buried right at the bottom and kind of muffled with a lot of pretty corporate jargony sounding language like effective from the 25th of March. Even that little word effective suggests a sort of slightly colder corporate tone that for some people is going to get in the way of the information they're looking for. So to help Halifax, we did a very quick rewrite of this, of how we think it could be clearer and more useful. And to start, we put the information right at the top. So from March 25th, we'll be open 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., Monday to Friday. This helps us focus on the services you need most, like withdrawing cash or giving advice if you're vulnerable or in financial difficulty. We may have to close some branches temporarily if we don't have enough staff. So the same sort of information is there, but it's structured in a way that is more useful for the visitor and means they can kind of get in, get out, and get what they need more quickly. Someone in the UK who's doing an amazing job with this at the moment is Money Saving Expert. They're a kind of financial guidance, help, expertise and tips website. And they've done a really great, amazing thing of translating what furloughing means, or in the UK, coronavirus job retention scheme, which is kind of a new piece of language that millions of people are having to kind of understand and unpack. And they've translated it really nicely as, think of this like a job being put on standby. So the writers clearly worked hard there to take something that feels new and unwieldy and a little bit intimidating and translate it into something that feels accessible and everyday. I think that's the sort of job that we as writers should be doing when we try and make things clearer. I suppose the second point to make about this is, how does clear information, how do we balance that with what a brand wants to say, with those kind of higher level brand messages? I think in this moment, more than ever, clear information needs to lead and the brand messages need to come secondary. I'll show you an example of another brand that, again, I think has slightly got off at the wrong start and put those brand messages at the beginning. So this is the Royal Mail. Dear customer, Royal Mail remains open for business as a key part of the UK's infrastructure. We take great pride in providing a lifeline for businesses and communities everywhere during the coronavirus. We want to assure all our customers that we're working hard to collect, process and deliver as much mail and parcels as possible in these challenging times. We understand the important role we have to play in helping in the nation's fight back against this virus. Now, you can understand how for an organisation like the Royal Mail, with all of its history and heritage and kind of pride, that they would want to communicate that. But I wonder whether some of those messages, they're not the things that customers are looking for right now. The kind of key thing that we want to know is the postal service still running? Can I still kind of go about my daily business and get the things that I need? Those brand messages feel secondary, but by putting them first in the way that the Royal Mail has done, it feels like they're kind of talking about themselves for the sake of it. It might make them feel good, but it's not necessarily delivering what the reader's looking for. So if they were to lead with something like this, we're still open for business, collecting and delivering your mail as always, that feels clearer, more useful, and then allows them to go on and talk about those brand messages. So I think it's really important to think about the order that you give something, give the reader something, and is it going to match with what they're looking for from a piece of writing? So that's clarity, the importance of making things as easy and accessible as possible and kind of putting the most important things first. The second point is authenticity, and Mike is going to talk through that.
Thanks, Sam. So yeah, I think authenticity in terms of the brand and being who you are is a really key point in times like this, because it's very easy to sort of withdraw from the brand elements and withdraw to something that feels very much more bland and formal as a sort of defense mechanism in a way. But I think it's really important that you stay true to your brand and to your voice, but obviously do that sensitively. You don't want to be turning into someone else all of a sudden. You should stick to who you are. So I think this is a really key point, and we've got a few slides on this. So quite surprisingly, in a way, McDonald's seem to have slipped up on this front. So they're quite an interesting example. So here's a bit of standard McDonald's copy. There's so much good stuff happening at McDonald's, from supporting UK farmers to helping grassroots football clubs grow, as well as working on our Happy Meal toy to make it more sustainable. So, that's a pretty ordinary bit of copy, but it's got that nice McDonald's friendliness. Unfortunately, right now, they seem to have withdrawn into a much more corporate voice. So here's a message from their president, the McDonald's USA president, which, apart from anything else, begins "Dear valued customer," which sounds like something from a direct mail letter of kind of 1952. And it's full of language like this. In the meantime, I want to inform you of the proactive steps McDonald's and our franchisees are taking to ensure the safety of our restaurants across all our communities in proactive partnership with local and national health authorities, which you can't even read on one breath, but also has that very formal or the technical voice about it that doesn't feel at all McDonald's, I think it's fair to say. And you can see the temptation, as I say, to kind of withdraw into this much more corporate tone. It feels like, if you like, a safe ground to be on. Doubtless people will be worrying that if they speak in their own voice, might they say something inappropriate or appear to be taking things lightly if they have a kind of lighter tone. But I think this is a really good demonstration of how dangerous it is to fall back on that, because suddenly it doesn't sound like the brand we all know, and that's quite unsettling actually, and not massively reassuring in a tonal sense, I don't think. You kind of wonder who this brand is that's talking to you that you thought you knew. So we think it's really important to stick to your tone and to focus on what you do. So we'll have all seen a lot of brands kind of trying to put out general messages about the crisis and about the coronavirus and perhaps about kind of social distancing and things like that, probably because they really feel they need to, but it inspires this sort of response a lot of the time. So there's a couple of, well, it's one Twitter and a reply that we've spotted recently. Marketing people, folks are scared and confused and eagerly checking email for work updates, emergency services and loved ones. If you're a mid-level copywriter at Yankee Candle, please do not update us on how your team is responding to the COVID-19 crisis. Literally no one cares. And then Anil Dash is a very well-known figure, 500,000 odd followers, obviously feels the same. So it can really, none of these address a specific brand necessarily, but they show the kind of backlash that you can get ensnared in if you try to kind of do a general message about how you're handling it, or trying to give advice beyond your own purview, if you like. So I think it's really important to, if you like, stay in your lane. And someone like Bulb, the UK energy company, do a very good job of this. So their own coronavirus communication is all about energy, as you'd expect, and addressing the fact that there's a lot of change going on, and this is how we're helping to make sure your energy supply is safe and secure. So that feels very relevant. It feels like them. The voice is still theirs, and it feels useful rather than just a general kind of shout. Monzo, always a good example for writing, and they're continuing to do a good job right now. So again, they're staying in their lane. They're talking about how we're supporting you and your money, very focused in that way. And again, the voice is Monzo's voice. They haven't fallen back on the very technical, complex, often very confusing corporate language that we've just talked about. And that brings us to the second bit. So, staying with what you do and staying with your voice. And there's some good examples already popping up of brands that are doing this really well. So the Prince Charles Cinema, if you don't know, it's a cinema in central London, in Soho. It's got a kind of edgy, independent brand and history. And the frontage now says, we'll be back, very positive, very confident, very them. They're not shying away from their voice or their brand. And in their email that they sent out to their customers, it says, to every person who has purchased a ticket, told a friend about to visit, bought a membership, or simply earmarked us for a future trip, thank you. You mean the world to us, and we can't wait to fling our doors back open, fire up the projector, and enjoy a night at the pictures with all of you. Until then, be kind, be safe, be healthy. We'll be back. So they're not trying to do a kind of public information thing. They know that everyone's getting that from other places, but what they are doing is being themselves, speaking to their audience in a way that that audience will recognize and appreciate, actually being really positive and really friendly, not flippant, but sticking to what they're all about. And it actually makes you feel quite good when you think about them flinging their doors back open and going back in to see a movie with them. So I think that's a really nice example. Kubits, the spectacle brand, has done a similar thing. So again, they have a very distinctive voice, a much lighter, quite almost edgy voice, very kind of friendly and informal, and they haven't abandoned that. So in their email, they say, today we'll be closing all our physical stores until it's safe to reopen. These are unprecedentedly difficult times, and we feel for our fellow small businesses, which is a really nice kind of shout out to the friends, if you like. It's tough, but overcoming days and weeks, we'll be calling on our incredible teams to focus on the positive, the pragmatic, and the thought-provoking. We fully intend on getting through this with as many of our brilliant people as possible, which is a useful, practical point. So as of tomorrow, we'll be doing things differently, whether that's upping our content, IGTV, proffering team stories, or sharing our errant humor. Remember that we're still here and open for business. Kubits.com is available for any orders, and our customer service team are on hand to answer any questions or to share a filthy joke. They're quite prepared to go that far and have a laugh with you. And while our shops may be closed, we can ship your orders. Our annual frame service is running as usual. If you have a mishap with the frame, our comprehensive repair service is available. And our magnificent optometrists are now on call 7 days a week for any eye health related questions. So, they've got a really strong voice there. They haven't backed away from that. They're allowing for humor and filthy jokes. They say love at the end, they can do this because they've built that brand, of course. Someone who suddenly sounded like this when they didn't normally would be equally strange, but it's really strong that they're taking this voice and running with it during the crisis. So clarity and authenticity. The last point, which I'm going to hand back to Sam, is humanity. So over to you, Sam.
Great, thank you. So humanity is a big word, and we're going to talk a little bit about what we mean by humanity or human sounding writing. I think the big point here is that there's a temptation. I think whenever you're writing about something serious, like what we're going through at the moment, the temptation is to then use serious sounding language because you think that the situation calls for it, and it's not the time for anything that feels light or flippant or whatever it might be. I think the danger there is that corporate language doesn't actually feel reassuring. It doesn't really feel like it's coming from a real writer. It doesn't feel like it's coming from a real group of people. It feels kind of cold. It's often confusing. It sometimes feels kind of routine or mechanical, as though it's been created by a bot rather than it's the product of someone who sat down and thought about how they should talk to their reader and what their reader needs. So we'll show you a couple of examples of this. First of all, I wanted to show the Twitter poem that I'm sure lots of you have seen already from Jessica Salfia. This is on the first lines of emails I've received while quarantining. In these uncertain times, as we navigate the new normal, are you willing to share your ideas and solutions? As you know, many people are struggling. I know you're up against it, the digital landscape. We share your concerns. As you know, many people are struggling. This, if you haven't seen it, got picked up by lots of news outlets and got shared and reshared again and again. And I think, aside from being a very funny poem, I think the reason why it struck such a chord is because it highlights how quickly the language of coronavirus has started to feel cliche and routine, and we're all feeling a bit of inertia from seeing these things so often. So even when lines like these might be written, sincerely, and they're well-meaning, and the writer really believes them, and the organization really believes them, if they're coming into your inbox every few minutes and everyone is using this sort of language, it starts to feel like wallpaper rather than something that someone has kind of sat down and considered. So I'm writing to let you know what we are doing to support you in these strange and uncertain times. I'm sure we've all seen sort of variations of that over the last few weeks. So I think the danger with corporate language is that it kind of gets in the way of what we're trying to say, and rather than feel reassuring, it actually feels sometimes a bit offhand or a bit routine. So I thought I'd show you another example. This is Ryanair, the low-cost airline. And let's take a look at how they are telling or asking passengers to help their staff. This is clearly an incredibly stressful situation for anyone who works on an airline. So the more that passengers can do to make their lives easier, the better it is for everyone. But here's how Ryanair are doing it. With low load, social distancing is being optimized on board, and we ask all passengers to cooperate fully with our crews who are doing their best in difficult times to maintain vital links to/from Ireland and to/from the UK to facilitate our passengers and their families to deal with emergencies that may require urgent travel over the coming days and weeks. Now, not only is that a shocking piece of writing that almost made me pass out reading it, it's full of all that corporate language that is getting in the way of what's a really crucial message. So social distancing is being optimized on board, for example. There are, I'm sure, dozens of more everyday, more accessible, warmer ways of saying that. Likewise, we ask all passengers to cooperate fully with our crews. There's almost a hint of suspicion there, as though Ryanair isn't quite sure, it can't quite trust its passengers to do what it's asking, so it kind of really needs to labour the point. So that corporate language is getting in the way of what it's trying to say, and far from feeling reassuring, just feels a bit cold, and almost as though it's coming from a bot and a giant organisation rather than a real group of people. Now, I wanted to take a look at an example of someone who's doing this really nicely and who is able to write with humanity and warmth and empathy. This is the email that Tesco sent out at kind of the beginning of the crisis, explaining the changes they were going to have to make to their business to meet the sort of overwhelming demand they'd experienced. We wanted to focus in on this paragraph in particular. At Tesco, we have been doing everything we can to keep business as usual, but we now have to accept it as not business as usual. We have to plan on the situation being the new normal, and we will do all that we can to make the food you want available, but we need your help. For an organisation as large as Tesco, with as many moving parts and layers, it's kind of remarkable that they've been able to craft this human, almost vulnerable tone. How many times have we really seen a brand say, "We need your help," as directly as that? Of course, they do need our help. They need our help to manage their stores and to keep things running. But the way they've done it feels just open and honest, as though it's coming from a real person to another group of real people, rather than kind of corporate jargon. And it could have been much worse. I mean, they could have written something like this. This is our very bad rewrite. For over 100 years, Tesco has been committed to maintaining the highest levels of service. However, due to this unprecedented crisis, Tesco has decided to implement a number of operational changes in order to ensure adequate supplies. Customers are thanked in advance for their support and patience. We've all seen writing like that. And again, for a brand like Tesco, that feels like the starting point. That's often the safety net that writers within those brands, within those big organizations fall back to, because it feels kind of solid and serious and considered. But it actually gets in the way of what you're trying to say and gets in the way of any sort of relationship between you and the reader. Before we move on to questions, and I think kind of finishing up that point about humanity, a final word of advice, I suppose, is that, as we've seen already, if a brand doesn't have anything particularly interesting or relevant to say, then it doesn't need to say it. I've received emails from a picture framing shop that I shopped with about 5 years ago telling me about what they're doing with coronavirus. That doesn't feel like the right moment. That's not, they don't have a role to play in this. If they want to tell me about their opening hours, then of course that's interesting. But this isn't a moment for every brand to start grandstanding and to feel like they need to say something. I think the temptation is sometimes irresistible, as we saw with that Royal Mail example, is that the larger the organization, the more you feel like you have to respond to this in kind of very big terms. But often that's not what readers, customers, audiences are looking for from us. So if we can kind of rein that impulse in and focus on making the language clearer, more authentic, more human, rather than sort of big and kind of matching the moment, I think that works better for the brand and for the reader as well. So quick recap before we move on to questions. So absolutely at the heart of everything we write should be clarity. That's the one thing that readers are looking for from us right now, I think. Kind of clear, simple information, removing any sense of fuzziness, helping people get by and move through their day quickly so they're not spending hours kind of burying, rooting through FAQs to try and find a key piece of information. That's all there up front for them. Authentic, if your brand is known for something, you've built that reputation, don't suddenly switch just because things have changed. Find out what that means for you and how you should respond in a way that feels authentic. And then finally, humanity. So writing with warmth and empathy, sincerity, even a little bit of vulnerability, if that's the right thing to do, and not kind of falling back into that safety net of very corporate, cold language, which, kind of gets in the way of what you're trying to say. So, we have seen the switchboard lighting up. So I think Orla is going to go through and pick out some of the most frequent or interesting or challenging questions, and we'll be happy to answer them. So over to you, Orla.
Great, thanks, Sam. Thanks for your questions, everyone. So we have a few coming in about using human voices when you feel like you need to be serious. So let's have a look. We've got a question from Steve on it seeming like the complex corporate language can happen when a client shifts their focus inwards rather than outwards to their customers. How do we deal with this challenge at ReadWords? And do we find that clients push back on using a more human voice, whether it's a time of crisis or not?
Tricky one. Well, Mike, I'd be interested in your thoughts, but my feeling is at ReadWords, we obviously come up against that a lot, and that the bigger the organization, the greater the temptation is, I think, to fall back and to use that corporate language because it feels appropriate and serious. I think we would always direct it back to the reader, to the audience, the customer, the client, whoever is at the sort of the end of the piece of writing. What are they looking for right now? And I think, as we saw in that Royal Mail example, that, people are looking at the moment for clear information rather than kind of big brand statements. So that's not to say those brand statements can't appear there in some form, but I think it's thinking more usefully about how you can order and structure a piece of writing so that the reader gets what they're looking for, rather than just kind of always being with the corporate voice and corporate statements.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's Steve is a very good point that complex language like that tends to come from when people start looking inward rather than outward. As Sam says, you need to keep the focus on the reader. And I really feel that it's very often a sign of worry and kind of fear of getting it wrong that drives people back into that kind of very corporate language. If it feels like something you've read 100 times before, then it's probably safe because people have been using it for so long. So it's a very tempting place to go. But I do think on the clarity angle, you risk losing that. On the authenticity angle, you clearly risk losing that, and humanity as well. You lose so much of the work you've done up to that point in terms of building your brand and voice. I think you really need to stay away from it, and ultimately it doesn't serve the reader because it just confuses or alienates people at the worst possible time. And
I think to that point, it often undermines what a brand is trying to do, or the things that brands are doing right now. So if you read any of the say press releases that fashion companies like Barbour have put out recently, they're turning their production lines over to creating hospital gowns. Now that is an incredible thing to do, but often the way they talk about it feels like it's just any other corporate initiative, and that feels to me like a slightly missed opportunity, and means that thing isn't going to be as noticed or received by as many people as it could do. So not only is it kind of not very useful for the reader, it's often not very useful for what brand or organization is trying to do.
And on that point, we had a question from Joe on what the best way is to communicate if you are trying to do something good at the moment, like offer your products for free or money for charity. What's the best way to talk about this without sounding self-serving, particularly if competitor brands are doing more?
Yeah, I think it's a really pertinent question at the moment. We ourselves have grappled with this, even about doing this webinar or other things. You know, how can you make the thing you're doing that you want to do for good reasons not look like it is just a kind of naked self-promotion? I think actually the points we've talked about are really important to making that work. So the clarity in terms of just being really upfront and straightforward about what it is you're doing. There's the Brewdog sanitizer example is a really obvious one here, because they were actually doing something basically really good. They were offering free hand sanitizer that they were making in their breweries, but they fumbled the communication and people thought they were selling it and trying to make a profit out of it. So that clarity point becomes very, very urgent at that point. You try and do something good and you end up with a backlash because you haven't been clear about it. So I think assuming you're not doing it on a nakedly self-serving basis, then just be really straightforward and upfront with people. Again, talking in a really human voice, addressing the fact that maybe it is that your work in other areas is drying up, so you're doing something else to sort of keep things moving and to offer stuff to your customers. That doesn't seem like an unreasonable thing to do. So I think be confident. If you're doing something for the right reasons, be straightforward and upfront about it. And again, speak in a really human voice that's true to you, and people will respond to that, I think.
Yeah, I think there's also, as we saw with that Tesco example, I think more than ever, there's license for brands to try things out and to take risks and to maybe get things wrong and to say, look, we don't know how this is going to work exactly, but this is the situation, so we want to do something. I think because so many things are changing and so much is up in the air, that customers and audiences are giving brands a little bit more license than they would normally to kind of figure out things as they go and to be a bit scrappy, bit more scrappy than they normally would be.
Yeah. Kat had a question that kind of relates to that, about businesses that have quite a corporate tone of voice to begin with, and now that they need to engage with their customers or members without using jargon that they're hearing in the news. Is it appropriate for them to be injecting more empathy and humanity into their tone of voice at this time, even if it wasn't like that before?
That's interesting.
I mean, I think if we're going to stand by authenticity, then they should stick to the voice that they have. So if you're a relatively formal bank or sort of management consultancy, something like that, then be that brand, keep that voice. But I think also keep in mind that you are still communicating with human beings, and especially right now, those human beings have all sorts of worries and needs for clear communication. So you can be serious and formal without being inhuman, I think. So again, stay true to your voice, but keep that reader in mind and keep what they need in mind, and don't start doing that thing of turning in on yourself.
And I think although we picked Halifax as a kind of bad example, I actually think lots of the banks in the UK are doing a pretty good job with this. So the way that they're talking about, say, mortgage holidays, for example, we had a look at those before we put this webinar together, and actually a lot of them are doing it in what feels like a really accessible, simple way. It still feels kind of formal and serious because that's kind of what you want from your bank, I suppose. But the jargon has been translated, the sentences are short, the FAQs are nicely laid out, the content is easy to get through. So they've clearly worked hard to make that information as clear as possible, because they know that, well, for a lot of people, the idea of a mortgage holiday is a scary thing. How does it work? What does it mean for my final payment? All those sorts of questions are being answered, I think, helpfully.
Yeah, just lastly, that's a good point. I think clarity is not just about the language you use; it's about how you structure your information. And that example of Halifax's opening hours, that was as much a structural issue as a tonal one. They just hadn't put the most important information up front. So it's not clear, and they can write as seriously and formally as they like. But if they're getting that information across in the way that makes sense to people and it highlights what's really important, then they've gone a long way forward.
And I think that's often one of the quickest fixes that we recommend, is that even if you don't want to get into the tone and to rewriting something, if you can just pull out that key piece of information and put it at the top, you often make a piece of writing 10 times more useful to a reader, even if you've only had to do something very simple.
Right.
Great. Just going back to a question Giorgio had about whether there's a risk if many brands are trying to adopt this more informal, approachable tone, that they'll all begin to sound very similar, and whether this even matters in a time of crisis.
Yeah, I think that goes back to, and it's not even just a crisis point. I think it's a general brand point that it's not about trying to adopt a different tone to address the situation you're in. It's about being the brand you are, which rather assumes you've got a clear voice in the first place. But assuming you have, sticking to that and thinking about how does this voice work in this situation, whether that's a crisis or anything else, positive or negative. Not, oh, what other voice should I be adopting in this situation? That's kind of being led by your environment rather than being true to yourself. So I think that's, as I say, that's a problem that a lot of brands have generally, quite apart from crisis times, and it becomes even more important now. So it's not like we're not saying adopt a new friendly voice. We're saying keep your own voice, but obviously remember that everything we would say is human to human communication, and we shouldn't forget that.
Mm-hmm. Great. Nina asks about resource, so thinking about time and having to get urgent messages out and not having much time to craft the messaging, and how do we manage that?
That's a really tricky one. That's something that we've been dealing with some of our clients recently. Is you've got something really urgent to say and you want to get it right. I think it just goes back to what's the most important piece of information and how can I communicate this as quickly as possible. So I think the starting point for a lot of kind of big organizations is to draft something that feels very lengthy, and then lots of people get together and they kind of pick over it and there are lots of track changes. I think if you can give that responsibility to a single writer and say, I want you to communicate this one thing for me as quickly and as easily as possible, then that's often a way of getting to it more quickly than if you go through the kind of rounds of lots of amends and lots of kind of discussion and complications. It's a really tricky one, but I think, again, always go back to the reader, to the audience, to whoever's at the end of the piece of writing, and say, what's the one thing that they're looking for most of all from us right now?
Yeah, it is really tricky. And as Sam says, we've been doing this with clients of our own, and it's often on a turnaround of maybe even an hour or two sometimes. And for professional writers, that's hard enough, never mind anyone. But yes, I think keeping that structural point in your mind, what is the thing that I really need, or rather that my readers really need to hear from this, not, oh, I should be saying X, Y, and Z about coronavirus because that's what everyone else is saying. Keeping that in mind, keeping the simplicity as much as possible in mind, and staying focused is a good way to keep it efficient.
And I think to that point, sort of remembering that whatever it is you're communicating is probably going to arrive into someone's inbox, let's say, alongside another 10 pieces of communication from other organizations or brands who think that their thing is equally important. So it's a lot to take in. And we're asking readers a lot at the moment. People skim read at the best of times, but I'd say more so than ever. So yeah, I think the emphasis on clear, quick, simple communication is more important than ever, and kind of filleting out the other messages that might feel a little bit like they're secondary. So our point of view on coronavirus, for example, how we're helping the global community, that's important, but it might not be the one thing that your reader is looking for.
Okay, let's do one more question then before we finish up. Jess has asked about, so with reference to brands that don't really have anything that useful to say on coronavirus, what should their approach to communicating with their clients or customers be? Should they be adopting a business as usual approach, sending out their usual newsletters and things?
That's a big question. I would say it kind of goes beyond language, actually, not to duck it, but it becomes a kind of marketing strategy question as much as anything, doesn't it? I think there you're kind of, again, you're sort of into the realm of, well, how do we do this sensitively? I mean, actually, we all know that business needs to keep going. It really, is vital for the country that it keeps going. So it's not like everyone should just shut up unless they're talking about coronavirus. But there probably is a value in acknowledging it. And so maybe don't just sort of send out something that feels like any other marketing message with no acknowledgement of what's going on. It might just be that there's a header or something that says, during the pandemic, we are running a purely online delivery service, or whatever the kind of, however it's affected that business. And then be yourself and carry on. And that's a useful thing to do that I think people will like to see as much as anything. So kind of reassurance almost.
Yeah, I think I've seen lots of brands take this as an opportunity to do something different because the situation has changed. So Qubits, for example, the spectacles brand that we looked at previously, are running a design competition where you design your own frames and they will make it in their workshop because, as they said, people are bored and stuck at home. And that feels right for that brand. It's not the kind of serious, kind of weighty thing, but it feels like an honest acknowledgement that a lot of people who wear Qubits glasses are kind of sat around and don't have much to do and occupy themselves. So this is an opportunity for them to get creative. Likewise, the museums, I think the museums in London and the UK are doing an amazing job at running things that, feel useful and interesting for people who aren't able to leave the house. So if it's something useful and interesting, then I would say lead with it. If it feels like naked commercialism, then that's not, I suppose, right for this moment.
Or if it just feels pointless,
Yes, exactly.
For the sake of it, then that's probably not a good idea. Okay, I think we're getting close to the end, Sam. Super,
great. Well, thank you all very much for your time. And thank you for those questions. They were pretty trickier than I was expecting, actually. But thank you very much. I should say this is the first of a series that we're doing. Next week is editing your writing, and that's where we'll look at how to put some of these principles into practice, really, the kind of real nitty-gritty craft of writing. How do you take something that feels kind of corporate and waffly and make it feel sharp and clear and accessible and all the things that we've talked about today? Then we'll look at something that we get asked a lot. As a kind of pure writing agency, we get asked the question of how do you work with writers? What's the best way to engage with a writer? From briefing to giving feedback to telling whether a piece of writing is actually good and worth paying for. So we'll look at kind of some of the tricks that we use when we work with strategists or designers or clients or whoever that might be. And then finally, we're going to look at something that we do a lot of, which is building a brand voice. So that's for brands who haven't quite worked out how they should sound, the sort of process we walk through where we kind of get into a brand and figure out how it should use language and how it should treat it. You can register for any of these on Eventbrite if you go back to the same link that you used to access this. After this, we will send round a very quick survey. It'll take a couple of minutes of your time. We would absolutely love as much feedback as possible. As Mike said, this is very much the first one of these we've run, so still slightly figuring things out. So we'd love to hear any suggestions, ideas you might have for future sessions or something you wish we'd covered now. Anything you can tell us would be really useful. But otherwise, thank you all very much for your time. Please feel free to drop us a line with any questions you might have. But otherwise, have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.